Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 3rd through 5th Sundays after Pentecost. And if I sound a bit strange, it's because I am still struggling with my muggleness and can't seem to get the Accio spell to work, so I can't find my recording equipment from my recent move. Sorry. We have a couple content notifications for this episode. Both of them are in our conversation about the 4th Sunday after Pentecost, which is the second Sunday we're talking about in this episode. In our conversation on the first reading, we talk about family separation and children being taken from their families and given up for adoption. And in our conversation on Galatians, we talk about racism, white supremacy, and white fragility.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch, hp@church.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Our first Sunday is the 3rd Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 8, also known as Lectionary 13, which falls this year on June 30th. The first passage is 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 15 through 16, and verses 19 through 21. The prophet Elijah is instructed by God to anoint his successor, Elisha. Elisha follows Elijah after being rebuked for wanting to say goodbye to his parents and feeding the community with 24 of their oxen as an apology. Whoa.
It's quite a story. I'd also like to point out that I think that the reason why the people who made the lectionary decided to get rid of those verses was, in this case, was pretty reasonable. There's a whole bunch more of difficult to pronounce names in there that aren't actually applicable to the story, if I'm remembering right. Oh, actually, there's a lot of death threats in there, too.
Oh, fun. Well, that's, the story of Elijah's life. And yet, he doesn't die. What? More
yes, so the verses taken out are a list of the people that, oh goodness. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so that's contextual, and would take a while to explain. And I'm still kind of okay with leaving out those verses, because, you'd have to write a sermon and a half about what the heck was going on there.
Yeah. So maybe suffice it to say, it actually makes sense why they left out the verses this
right.
time.
That does happen sometimes. We are not always in complete disagreement with the people who organized the lectionary. Just sometimes.
So, speaking of organizing the lectionary and appointing the readings, one thing that I noticed in this passage was a theme of anointing and appointing. So we get God's command to Elijah to anoint the kings and then to anoint Elisha and appoint them all to their roles. And then I was thinking about it and I was like, what is the process in the magical world for appointing people to positions of authority? Because we don't ever hear about it. I just started the 6th Harry Potter book in Spanish which I do while I run at the gym, and it's got the other minister in it, and it talks about the transition from Fudge to Scrimgeour. But all we know is that, of course he wasn't going to stay in power when he ignored the return of Voldemort. But we don't get the, flip side of that, which is, how did they choose who was next? Did they vote? Did they appoint somebody? Did they, have some magical method, like the Sorting Hat or the Goblet of Fire?
Does it follow the British Parliament system, which I confess I'm not as familiar with as I'm sure many of our listeners might be, but I'm pretty sure it has to do with once a certain leader visibly has a vote of no confidence, then somebody from the leadership of another party takes over.
Well, it's not necessarily another party, so that's actually a really apt example right now. In general, it changes when the party in power changes or the coalition group in power changes, but for example, right now, Theresa May got a vote of no confidence. Basically, like, so she's resigning, but her party gets to pick another person because they're still the majority party.
Right, okay. So Rufus Scrimgeour and Cornelius Fudge could have been members of the same party.
Right, but are there even parties in
Right.
the magical world? It's so spread out and there's so few people. Like, I don't know. Or is it like the House of Lords versus the House of Commons, where all of the, like, pure blood groups get automatic seats? And
I have to say, I think if there was a House of Lords, then Lucius Malfoy would have been in it, and if Lucius Malfoy was in it, Draco would have bragged about it.
That's true.
When we reach verse 19, I would like to point out that when Elijah throws his mantle onto Elisha's shoulders, Elisha would have known what that meant. It's not like, say, Harry wandering up behind Colin one day and tossing the invisibility cloak on him for laughs. There's a point to this. This is Elijah appointing his successor. And so Elisha knew that he was being called to service. Although I like the mental image of Harry wandering up behind people and throwing the invisibility cloak on them.
That would be
but
hilarious.
That would let people know that he had one, which would be a problem. So.
Mm-hmm. That would be fantastic. Yeah. I would laugh so hard. Well, and I think the go back right after that, when Elisha is like, wait, hold up. And then Elijah's like, go back again, for what have I done to you? It made me think about Harry's feelings in Deathly Hallows when he finally arrives at the Burrow and Mad Eye's dead and he's really getting some of the gravity of the risks that people are in. And he always has a fairly good sense of it, but it's one of those, like, even when you know what you're getting into, right, then there's that moment of realization where it's like, oh boy.
Also, like, Mad Eye was one of the people who was most capable of taking care of himself in that situation. So if he's the one that died, that's
even more of a risk for other people. Yeah, and so Harry's, like, response to all of this is to be like, I've got to go. I can't stay here. You're all in danger while I'm here. I don't want to put... And it's so funny because they all, like, have different ways of getting to him and being like, no, this is what we are committed to. And then we see Elisha, like, go slaughter all the oxen.
Yeah, so when we reach verse 21, no matter how rich Elisha's parents are, 24 oxen butchered is still sacrificing a lot of their property.
And all of the equipment.
Yeah, like, Elisha has not come into his inheritance yet. This is not his stuff to destroy. So, like, take the story of the prodigal son and times it by a few, I think.
It's not
even... no warning to the father at all. Yep. You know, I don't want to get into the specifics, but I've hung out with enough farmers to know that slaughtering that number of livestock takes a while, let alone actually boiling the meat, which is not how I would have chosen to cook up that much beef in a fairly short amount of time. Like, the sheer amount of water and pots and such needed, that would have taken days. There's no way that his parents didn't hear about what was going on and come out to find out what was going on, and so he got to say goodbye to them anyway, right? That's how this worked, I have to imagine, because this could have taken days, especially if he's doing it on his own. Like, I like to imagine Elijah in a little beach chair with a drink with a little umbrella in it, watching all this.
Right, just waiting and watching and being like, wow, this is who God chose to follow me. Oh boy.
Yeah,
I mean, to be fair, like, Elijah has his own penchant for going over the top, so it kind of fits,
all of these people have a lovely sense of the dramatic, by all means. Yeah. You really don't get to be a prophet of God and not have a sense for drama.
I believe there's a Kingsley quote about, you may not like him, minister, but you've got to admit, Dumbledore's got style. That is a qualification to be a prophet.
Yes, but I think in this particular case, I would instead quote Douglas Adams and say to Elisha, 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking.
That's fantastic.
I love that line. So this is one of those things where what Elijah says to Elisha about don't go back and say goodbye to your parents, just mysteriously disappear from a field and leave 24 oxen there with no apparent reason for having gone. That doesn't match up to modern sensibilities. There are some things that happen in the Bible that we don't really get the cultural reasoning behind. And so to us, this story might sound more like Elijah is demanding something of Elisha, like what Voldemort would demand of Lucius, because I can't really imagine Dumbledore saying something like this to much of anybody. Or for that, well, okay, Dobby would probably sacrifice 24 oxen if Dumbledore sneezed and Dobby interpreted it to mean that meant that Dumbledore wanted him to, but
Dobby's complicated.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So there's some cultural background there that we don't really have, but also I would say that Elijah is trying to make the point to Elisha that part of this life of being a prophet is going to be wildly unpleasant and unpredictable and difficult. And so if you expect that it's going to start easily, that's not going to give you a good idea of what the rest of it's going to be like.
Yeah. So the thing that I keyed in on, obviously, was the utter destruction of everything for completely different purposes, right?
Yes.
And you know, echoing what you said, it seems wasteful and cruel to Elisha's entire family.
Also, I know you're a vegetarian, Emily, but I'm not. I like beef. Wasting that much good beef by boiling it is not exactly sacrilegious, but it's very, very close in my family, because if you're going to, cook something, cook it well. And I object. He should have barbecued.
So the thing that I was thinking about, I was trying to think about where in the books that this happens, and Hogwarts is kind of the main place where something is completely destroyed for the sake of another thing. So the purpose of Hogwarts is education, presumably, but it's completely destroyed for the sake of safety and liberation for the magical community during the Battle of Hogwarts. But then just now I thought of the Fountain of Magical...
destroyed. I mean, there was still a room to put the bodies in at the end.
Yeah, but, the amount of things that were, taken apart and, broken apart and stuff. But then I just now thought of the Fountain of Magical Brethren. And that's actually, one of those things that I'm like, yes, destroy that. Destroy that fountain completely. And they did, but then they built something even worse.
Our second reading for this episode, and also for this first Sunday of this episode, is from Galatians chapter 5, beginning with verse 1, and then continuing with verses 13 through 25. Paul instructs us to serve one another out of love from the freedom that Christ has granted us. He describes the fruit of the Spirit as a contrast to the works of the flesh.
So one of the themes that comes up, which will be, no surprise to any of our listeners that I am coming up with this, noticing this theme, but the theme of false binaries, hashtag false binaries. Paul really heavily emphasizes this and creates this binary between flesh and spirit. And the ways that has then played out throughout our church history are really problematic. It's been used to really shame people about their bodies, to shame people about sex and sexual desires, and to create this false binary between what is good for our bodies and what is intellectual or spiritual. So that actually goes against what we know in other places and throughout Scripture, and particularly in Jesus, who is God incarnate. And so if God chooses to take on human form in the form of Jesus, then we can't think about human form as being this horrible thing. It is, in fact, something that God desires and God values.
And God created and said was good.
Mm-hmm. And so what Paul is more talking about isn't our bodies and our actual flesh, but the ways that we do things on impulse, for example, or thinking about the things that we do that are without care or concern for other people.
Right.
That I think a better way of thinking about it today is individualism, because the examples that he gives are very much individual examples, right? Fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery. They're focused so much on one person and what they do and what they can do versus communal care, which I think is a kind of cool binary to like set up of like
Right.
I think you can take it to the extreme, but
And I would say I've always personally thought of the binary that Paul sets up here in terms of the ways that our bodies can get in the way of us celebrating the fruits of the Spirit. For example, I have ADHD, and if I don't take my medication, boy, oh boy, do I get irritable and short-tempered, and I do not have the patience or the joy or the whatever else that Paul celebrates as a fruit of the Spirit. Or I am also one of those people who I have far, far less tolerance for fasting from meals, for example, than most people. My blood sugar, I'm not technically diabetic. I might get there one day, but I'm a little touchier about my blood sugar levels than most people. Mm-hmm. I am not someone who chooses to fast as a spiritual discipline because I have heard about what I'm like when I try it. And no one wants to be around me. That does not work for anybody. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of the body getting in the way of the Spirit, you might say. As long as you attend to the body, it doesn't get in the way of the Spirit generally.
Yeah, that part of the way the body's getting in the way is that you're not tending to it when you're fasting or like those sorts of things. Yeah. So then I was thinking about false binaries that are created in the magical world, and I think the house characteristics and ideals are actually really good examples of this. So there's a binary that kind of gets created between being kind, a key characteristic of Hufflepuff, and being clever, a key characteristic of Ravenclaw, that you can be one or the other, but you couldn't possibly be both.
I would definitely agree with that. The number of people I've met who assume that gifted children have fewer emotions than quote-unquote normal children, and therefore should be treated differently, is kind of stunning.
I have a really high IQ, and I'm an Enneagram 5 with a 4 wing, which means I'm really, really deep in my head and I'm really, really deep in my heart. Like, those two things exist in my body.
I have never been able to figure out the Enneagram, and I apparently have like 4 different numbers that apply to me, as far as I can tell.
Which
so
probably means you're a 6, but...
Oh. That was not one of them, I don't think.
Oh, fascinating.
But I don't remember. It's been a while.
Yeah.
But to get back on topic... Right, being kind and being clever are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and also both are valuable, but ultimately speaking, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm a Hufflepuff is because I love having kind people around me. Having clever people around, that can be useful.
It can also be annoying, speaking as a clever person. Like,
yeah, depending on...
I can get annoying.
That's fine. I'd rather be the person annoying someone than have other people annoying me. Oh man, that's probably a horrifically selfish thing to say, isn't it? At least I can control myself sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and the other false binary that I was thinking about is the one between Gryffindor and Slytherin of braveness versus drivenness, and the idea that like Gryffindors will just like burst through the door, and the Slytherins will be like all strategic and driven, like still like going to get where they need to go, but like more sneaky about it. And there's actually ways that the drivenness and the bold and the bravery really like complement each other and help, like to have both is actually helpful in getting something done.
Right, which is illustrated by the fact that Harry very nearly wound up in Slytherin himself.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In the passage, when we read, "But through love become slaves to one another," Paul's exhortation to the people in Galatia, this definitely feels like Dobby becoming a slave, right? Dobby does this. He becomes a slave again in love in so many ways. Even though he's getting paid by Dumbledore, even though he's a free elf, he is so much at the beck and call of Harry or even of Aberforth, of any of the wizards, because they're all men who are doing this, that there's a way in which he remains enslaved. And part of that is that, like, the way that it's more problematic and everything is problematic with Dobby is because it's not mutual. It's not becoming slaves to one another. Harry is not a slave in love, through love, to Dobby. He cares about him, but he is not, he doesn't serve Dobby the way that Dobby serves him.
He's not subject to him.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And so because those power dynamics remain, it's not a perfect example. But yes, hashtag W is problematic. Always.
Yeah, Snape and Lily also would be a really terrible example of becoming slaves to one another in love. Oh, no.
No, that's not even... Well,
I was trying to think if there's any good examples in Harry Potter. I mean, the Weasleys seem to have a reasonably healthy marriage, but we don't really see evidence of them.
But they're not like
doing this exactly.
Slaves to one another necessarily.
Well,
like they're a little, but not really.
They're good for each other. They support each other, but we don't really see evidence of that. But I could believe that there are times when that happens for them. But I don't know. That would require a lot of speculation. In verse 15, we hear, "If you bite and devour one another, take care you are not consumed by each other." There are some Bible verses that I kind of want to embroider and put on my office wall, and this is one of them. Because I love it as a concept for advice to a church community. If you're going to bite and snipe at each other, you're going to get consumed by that. And often we let our disagreements with each other get in the way of the work of the church or in the way of other more important work going on. Like, for example, when Ron thought that Harry had put his name in for the Goblet of Fire in Book 4, and completely forgot and ignored the fact that Harry was going through a legitimately life-and-death series of events and refused to help him while he was doing that. That was an example of friends having a fight, which happens, and then it gets in the way of some fairly serious stuff that's going on until Ron finally gets his head on right, and then comes to his senses and realizes that maybe I should be more supportive of my friend who...
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of those characteristics of Ron's that get in the way, as we continue on, we get the works of the flesh that Paul is talking about, that we already talked about a little bit. And I was thinking about those, a lot of those are, right, like anger, quarrels, dissensions. So they're not all completely bad. Right? It's okay to be angry. Anger is an important emotion, and it helps clue us into what's going on in the world and to how we're feeling. And the place where it gets to the extreme and where these sorts of characteristics get to be too much and then become problematic for the living of the community is like in Deathly Hallows when they're all wearing the locket as a Horcrux.
Yeah.
It makes everything worse. And so the quarrels are bigger, the anger is bigger, the dissension is bigger, the jealousy is bigger. All of those things is felt so much more strongly by whoever is wearing the locket. And in general by the group, because they always have to wear the locket. Yeah. And so they're thinking about when they're going to next wear it, even if they're not wearing it.
Speaking of verses 19 through 21. These verses are often read by people as meaning that anyone who does any one of these things, even once or a few times, will not get into heaven. But the kingdom of God generally in the Bible refers to the world that we're living in now, while alive. And so Paul is really saying that these kind of actions won't lead to living in a world that is as God would hope for, the kind of world that God would want, characterized by the fruits of the Spirit. The contrast between the fruits of the Spirit and the works of the flesh don't match up perfectly with the differences between the world as envisioned by Dumbledore and the world as envisioned by Voldemort. But there are some interesting similarities, aren't there? And I have to say that in most of the fan fiction that I've read, that seems to line up surprisingly well in terms of people who have written the What If Voldemort Won stories. Mm. Most of what shows up on the list of the works of the flesh, those show up in those fanfiction stories. So
interesting. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 62. Jesus sets his face for Jerusalem and heads towards his crucifixion. On the way, he encounters potential disciples, from whom he demands similar determination. So, a theme that I noticed was determination. So you can't talk about determination without talking about apparition, because of course, apparition requires the 3 Ds: destination, determination, and deliberation. That's all I really have that connects to apparition, though, because I was actually thinking about Harry's determination to find, when it comes to the final Horcrux, that once he figures out once all of the pieces fall into place for him, he gets so single-mindedly determined to find it. No matter what, he won't even pause to plan, like Hermione is smartly suggesting, but also, like, doesn't know the urgency. He knows the urgency because he's also in Voldemort's emotions. But that he's just like, nope, we have to go to Hogsmeade now so we can get into Hogwarts, so we can search for the thing and find it. And both of them end up the same way. Death and
pretty
new life.
much.
What?
Well, I mean, Jesus at least planned for that.
True. Harry kind of got a little surprise bit of information there. When I was thinking about verse 53 specifically, where the people did not receive Jesus because his face was set toward Jerusalem, I was thinking about in Deathly Hallows when they're wandering around camping in all the different places and like sneaking into towns and taking food and leaving money on the cash registers.
Stealing apple pies off of windowsills and things like
leaving money in the hens' nests and taking their eggs. That part of what determines whether or not they stay in a town is they have some encounters, close encounters with Dementors. And so if they find Dementors in the town, then they leave. And that's a different way of not receiving, right? Like,
yeah.
But there's this way in which that cut off of emotion, right? Like, they're cut off of emotion because Dementors embody depression. And so that cut off of emotion can get in the way of their determination. I'm blending the two. To get the Horcruxes and figure out what's going on and to, not die.
Which is generally a good thing to be determined about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Usually. Not always, but usually.
I mean, Jesus isn't exactly determined to die. You could really say that he's more determined to rise again after dying. But,
Mm-hmm.
In verse 54, I read this verse, and I have this hilarious mental image of Rupert Grint turning to Daniel Radcliffe and saying, "Do you want me to rain fire down on the Daily Prophet to consume them because they don't believe you that Voldemort's back?" And the look on Daniel Radcliffe's face in my head is just fantastic.
That's
I would love to see
hilarious.
these two do it on purpose. I read this verse, and I like to imagine that the reason why it's phrased that Jesus rebuked them is put that way, because it took a good long while for him to explain to them using very small words why what they just said was so incredibly wrong. And everyone remembers how epic it was, but they just can't get it into words when it's finally written down several decades later.
That's fantastic. Now that image is in my head, too, of Rupert Grint and of, like, actually Hermione doing the rebuking and explaining, right? Like, this deep sigh.
Yes,
Hermione.
Harry would have just done a facepalm.
Yeah,
like
Harry would have
like
facepalmed, and then Hermione does this deep sigh and then goes, "Now Ron." And then explains it all. Yeah.
I don't actually think Ron would have said that. I think that they all would have been tempted to rain just a little bit of fire here and there, but I don't think that he actually would have said that. But if any of them was going to, it would have been Ron, I will admit.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Although,
but I also really like the mental image of the look on Rupert Grint's face, particularly, of saying so.
Well, and in Deathly Hallows, when the Death Eaters find them at the coffee shop, that's, especially in the movies, I don't know for sure about the books, but Rupert Grint, as Ron, says, "We should finish him off, right?" And they're like, "No, we can't finish them off." And then he, like, does weird, creepy stuff. But he wants to kill the Death Eaters. And instead they do memory charms and stuff. But in verse 57, I was thinking about, this kind of echoed, I had a pause when we were doing the first reading because I couldn't remember where I had put this connection. So this echoes our first reading, but we hear someone say to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." And that person inevitably has, like, no idea what is to come. They don't know what they're really asking for in that sense. Ron and Hermione also say to Harry, "We're following you wherever, no matter what." They say it at the end of the Half-Blood Prince, and they say it at the beginning of Deathly Hallows also. And then they start to realize that, well, that Harry doesn't really know what he's doing, but there's also this realization of just how deep it is. Like, there's a way that we can think about how heavy things are going to be, but when we get actually in it, inevitably, it's always so much deeper. And even Harry has that. Like, he doesn't know that ultimately he's going to die, but that for Ron especially was a tricky part, where he, in his own reconciling of, I thought you knew what you were doing, I was going to follow you, but I didn't expect this, he ends up leaving, and Hermione has the same struggle, but ends up staying.
Yeah.
And then Ron comes back, which is good.
Yeah. When we reach verse 60, and I generally hear this phrase, this verse rephrased as, let the dead bury the dead. That's the phrase that I grew up with. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, that phrase was often used very much the same way as the phrase, let sleeping dogs lie. Mm. Basically, that the matter is essentially closed and irrelevant, so just let it go. Which totally removes the context that makes it such a stunning thing for Jesus to have said to this guy.
Yeah.
Now, I did once, and I don't remember where, so I can't cite it. I apologize. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, please let us know. But I did once hear it suggested that the father that this man mentions to Jesus might not have actually been dead yet. Was this guy saying, let me go home, wait for him to die, then bury him, then follow you. Which totally gives Jesus' reply a completely different context and has it make much, much more sense. Because, as far as I'm concerned, because that's asking a whole different thing, right?
That's asking for the question is time. Yeah.
Yeah. Is the guy asking about an immediate responsibility to his family, or is he asking about the ultimate responsibility to his family, which is to care for an aging parent? You know? Yeah. And as opposed to just burying someone who has presumably just recently died, otherwise they would have already been buried. So there's that thought. I mean, imagine if Sirius Black, or Regulus Black for that matter, might even be a better choice, had insisted on waiting for his mother to die before going against Voldemort. Right? Mm. In real life, I want to point out, I have known people who have refused to change Christian denominations until a certain family member has died. That's not quite the same thing, especially since the vast majority of those cases are people switching from Catholic to Lutheran, and we share a baptism, so that's not really anywhere near as big of a deal. You're still following the same Jesus, it's just you're changing the paperwork for how you do it.
Although I have heard of people changing religions and waiting for, like,
that gets more complicated, because then there's the question of when do you truly become a Christian? Is it when the ink on the paperwork is dry, or is it when you come to believe in your heart, or what? So,
well, and I guess like part of it is, I don't think it's actually been converting to Christianity, but converting to other faiths. Potentially from Christianity, but it's been like I can't officially do this until so-and-so.
Because it will literally kill my family member. Mm-hmm. And hey, I am all in favor of people not killing their family members. Let's just get that one right out into the open. So.
But I also, like, the other piece of this, though, and I was told this, I was discouraged from telling my grandmother, from coming out to my grandmother, because it would be too hard on her. And that's a really harmful way of using this sort of idea. And that's not what Jesus is getting at, but that is a way that this sort of idea of, like, waiting till someone dies to do things or change things is really harmful.
To be yourself.
Yeah, can be super harmful to people. And, like, coming out is not always safe, so there's, like, complexities in that. But
oh, sure. Our next Sunday for this episode is the fourth Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 9, also known as Lectionary 14, depending on which system you're using. And this year it falls on the 7th of July. Our first reading for this is from Isaiah chapter 66, verses 10 through 14. On return from exile, restoring Israel was not as easy as the exiles had hoped. The prophet Isaiah reminds the people that they are loved and supported by the mothering figures of Jerusalem, their heritage, and God.
So, once again, Mrs. Weasley embodies who God is. The theme that kind of carries throughout this passage of Isaiah is the comfort of God and Jerusalem and the heritage of the people, and it is very much portrayed as a mothering comfort. And you're making a face.
Oh, I love the idea of Mrs. Weasley as a comforting God, but when we talk about God being a mothering figure, one of the other mothering images of God in the Bible is as a mothering hen.
Which is also...
Anyone who has worked with chickens who have specifically hens who have baby chicks, know that while hens are very caring of their chicks, they are also specifically known as being wildly, angrily defensive of them towards everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And you can totally, I had an uncle who lost a decent chunk of his hair to a very angry hen once, although to be fair, he earned it, and he was also 9 at the time, so... So when I think, I know that Mrs. Weasley has her moment of defending Ginny, and I'm not going to argue with that, because goodness knows she was perfectly capable of doing it. But my mental image of the mothering hen god is more along the lines of, say, Professor McGonagall, who is frankly capable of being terrifying in defense of her students, So I love the image of Mrs. Weasley as the comforting mother figure, but I also see Professor McGonagall in that in a different way. So
I will grant that McGonagall definitely has the fierceness, but I think that Mrs. Weasley has the fierceness too. And this is not an example of God as mother hen. This is just a mothering God, right? But I do...
You just asked me about why I was making a face.
Yeah, no. So. But I do think that Mrs. Weasley works really well as the comforting, mothering figure of God. Yes. But I do, there is this fierceness, and it's not just when she's defending Ginny against Bellatrix. There is this fierceness that she has, such a pointedness and a,
See, the other example of Mrs. Weasley being fierce that comes to mind is her sending the tiny little chocolate egg and the wasn't it a tiny little sweater to Hermione when she thinks
not a tiny Hermione sweater, just the tiny egg for Easter.
Yes, just the tiny egg for,
as opposed to the giant eggs for everybody else. Yeah, that she's defending her own.
Yeah.
Or even with the Howlers, right? Because sometimes defending your own is being really
reminding them who they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I love Mrs. Weasley as a comforting God and as a mothering God. I think she just is a great figure for that almost every time. There are certain ways where I'm Mrs. Weasley, not your best moment.
Well, I've also mentioned before that while a lot of people talk about mothers as being a primarily comforting figure, and my mother was very good at that, still is, absolutely. When I was a small child, my mom took on the role of disciplinarian and my dad took on the role of more nurturer. And that has also made my mental images for mother and father figures a little different than most people.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's this is a side note, which maybe...
Oh, I think we wandered into tangent territory 15 minutes ago.
No,
as we tend to.
But that's similar to how I interact with my grandparents. That my grandparents, because we would go out there for several weeks each summer, and my mom would be gone for part of those weeks, my brother's interactions with our grandparents were our primary caregivers for a few weeks, and so our interactions had a disciplinary side to them in a way that a lot of people don't experience with their grandparents, where their grandparents are just loving balls of cuddling love, and ours were disciplinarians, and my brother and I argued plenty to deserve that, but so our relationship with them was different than a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
So on verse 10, when we hear God call the people to not only rejoice with Jerusalem in joy when they are joyful, but also rejoice with Jerusalem in joy, all you who mourn over her. I was thinking about Bill and Fleur's wedding, in the midst of and in spite of the impending doom that everyone knew was coming, and the way that it was this joyful moment in the midst of mourning, right? Like literally days before Mad Eye Moody had been killed.
Right.
Just a couple months before Dumbledore had been killed, and they had decided that Snape was a traitor, so they all felt betrayed and all of this stuff. And yet, in the midst of all of that, there's this joy. And that's similar for anybody in Harry's year for when they were born, right? That for the most part, those families gave birth and had kids in the midst of the war and the chaos and fear of that war.
Right. Which in America's own history could be compared to the children who were born during World War II and largely wound up getting called the Forgotten Generation or the Silent Generation because...
Baby boomers came next.
Well, yeah, but also they were born during war and they didn't get that whole celebratory period of their childhoods that the baby boomers got. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was part of the shift between kids being a source of labor and kids having their own identities and their own culture and their own space. Yeah. Well, and speaking of raising kids, verses 12 through 14, God talks about this nourishment that leads to growth. So both like how a mother or a parent figure might nurse a child and as a mother might comfort their child, those sorts of things. And it's that nourishment that also leads to growth for the child. And so I was thinking about Harry and Dudley and their growing up, where Dudley receives the nourishment as he grows up, and both the physical nourishment, but also the emotional nourishment and encouragement to do whatever he wants and be whoever he wants to be. And Harry...
Not always in a healthy way.
Not always in a healthy way. But Harry doesn't receive that. He doesn't receive the physical nourishment as much. He's in a closet, so there's only so big that he can actually grow. And he doesn't receive the emotional encouragement. And so when we find him at age 11, almost 11, he is scrawny, quiet, and unsure of himself. And then as he finally gets that nourishment at Hogwarts, it's this beautiful, like, blossoming of... He starts to figure out who he is, and he starts to have his own ideas and be more sure of himself, and he grows, and he becomes a, like, fully grown human.
Right. Well-rounded.
There we go.
Yeah, I would especially point out that in verse 13 we get the phrase, as a mother comforts her child, and while that happened for Harry during the first year of his life, he doesn't have any conscious memories of it. And we are currently, in this country, learning all the more right now about how traumatic that is for children. It's not something he grew up with. And so that is an additional trauma that he deals with during his life.
Mm-hmm. Especially, like, you are alluding to it, but just to name explicitly, right? Like, that we have children at the border who are 4 months old, who are separated from their family, and we have children who are, you know...
who are not at the border because they've been taken and placed with foster families and placed for adoption in many cases, and some of those adoption agencies are making money from this. But we are not doing a political podcast, so...
I mean, I was like, everything is political.
Well, yes, okay. It's God and Jesus and people, and so of course it's political, but you know. Okay, so to move on to a slightly lighter note, also in this little section of this reading, we hear that God provides the mother figure of Jerusalem. So I think that makes God more of a grandmother figure in this text than a mother figure. Which makes me ask myself, where are the grandparents other than Neville's grandma in the Harry Potter books? Like, they all seem to be conveniently absent. Like, wouldn't Hermione's grandparents on both sides have some things to say about her parents emigrating to Australia suddenly, and suddenly not remembering their daughter? Or,
yeah, they
like,
can't
are
all
they
have
retired?
died.
I know. How many people have died? And, or, like, have they conveniently retired and moved to the south of France or something because they were also dentists and had really good retirement plans? I don't know. What socialized medicine can do for you. Speaking of not doing a political podcast. Or, for example, were Ron's grandparents any help with the Weasley kids when they were growing up? And were they at Bill's wedding and we just didn't notice? Or where were Lily and Petunia's parents? Actually, that strikes me as the kind of thing I could Google for.
Well, we know that, like, at least for Lily and Petunia's parents, they had to have died. The Potters died. But why
The Potters died because they were specifically elderly when they had James.
How elderly do you have to be magical people and be elderly when you die, when you have kids?
And also be young enough to have kids. Yeah, I wonder about that. I'm reading the article on the lexicon about Lily, and it just says that both of her parents died before 81. And nothing else on the lexicon about her parents, which feels weird because she and her sister would have been very young. Okay, so there's a theory in an article from Bustle about Lily Evans' parents, which will apparently break what's left of your heart.
Of course it will.
This is actually a quote from Tumblr user The Little Merms. Oh, could Lily have done something similar to what Hermione did with her parents and wiped their memory?
No, she would have. Oh,
but that didn't happen to the Dursleys.
Yeah, she wouldn't have done that.
Maybe she just told them to move and cut off contact. And if James and Lily didn't bother to tell anyone where her parents were, because the possibility of Harry being raised by them as Muggles didn't even occur to the wizarding community. Even if they did die, they had Sirius and Lupin and Peter. Harry would almost certainly be raised in the wizarding world they would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
So Dumbledore wouldn't have been able to find her parents or didn't even try that hard to look. And now Lily's parents are just living their lives having no idea what happened to their daughter and never even knowing that she died or possibly never even knowing that they had a grandson. Yikes.
Right.
Well, that's depressing. Okay, sorry. I'll put a link in there. But yeah, so where are all the grandparents in Harry Potter? And they can't all have conveniently died. I mean, how prevalent is smoking in the wizarding world? There's only so many people you can kill off via cigarettes.
There's only so many people you can kill off via cigarettes.
That's the traditional way of conveniently getting rid of someone without also saddling someone with a genetic tendency towards something dangerous in stories. So
That's true. Interesting. Our next reading is from Galatians chapter 6, with the option of verses 1 through 6, and then verses 7 through 16. As Paul finishes his letter to the Galatians, he reminds them that they will reap what they sow, and gives some suggestions for how to include those in the community who continue to follow Jewish ritual laws. So a theme in this passage of Galatians is the policing or controlling of bodies. And Paul is pushing back against a desire to dictate in any direction what people do with their bodies, particularly around circumcision. But this idea that any group within the followers of the way that Paul is talking about within the early church would dictate, oh, you have to do this or you're not allowed to do this. And so Paul's trying to navigate what it means to be, as we heard in our last reading from Galatians from our previous Sunday, that you're not enslaved to any one part. You're not stuck in any one thing, but to navigate outside of that and to say, you know what, you don't get to control what others do with their bodies, and they don't get to control what you do with your body. And to try and navigate that is a lesson that we still haven't learned in my country, at least.
Or Britain, from what I hear.
Or Britain. And I think there's a way in which the whole world and the magical world also haven't learned this lesson, right? The ways that gender is policed and the ways that bodies are controlled, right? That Hogwarts has girls' dorms and boys' dorms. They don't have space that is gender neutral or gender inclusive or all gender in the Hogwarts Mystery app. You have to choose either to be a boy or to be a girl. You can't choose any other option, and you can't. It's the one characteristic out of all of them. Name, skin color, eye color, face shape, all of those things you can choose, and you can change them at some point during your game, but you cannot change your gender. Once you pick your gender, it is set for the entirety of the game. And there are like practical excuses that you can use for why it's that case, but it is controlling the bodies and who is defined as what and who counts as what.
Right. I totally agree.
And this is like this kind of policing and controlling of bodies is part of why fan fiction is so wonderful, because then we get to experience tonks as gender nonconforming, gender fluid, non-binary, the supremely queer person that they are, without having to rely on what J.K. Rowling says, because she does not understand gender at all.
Right.
I also, as I was thinking about the beginning of this passage in Galatians, I was caught by Paul's opening where he says, "If anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness." As we're recording this, the night before, so last night, I went and saw Emmanuel, the documentary about what happened at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and I'm facilitating a discussion on it on Thursday, so I'm right in this space where I'm thinking about it an extra lot, and thinking about the ways in which white people are consistently, and have been for like forever, right? People of color have been asking this of us for forever, but that white people need to talk to white people about racism, and this really stuck out to me of like, for those of us who are white and who have received the Spirit, who have kind of had an awakening of what it means, of like starting to be aware of what it means to be white, and how white supremacy and racism are really harmful and are also systemic, and the importance and the need for us to then talk to other white people about this and explain it to them. And a lot of times it has to be in a spirit of gentleness, because there's so much white fragility, and because we've never had to think about it, we've never had to deal with the discomfort around racism, and so it is work that we as white people need to do, not because people of color can't, but because they shouldn't have to. It shouldn't be their responsibility to carry our emotional labors, because they've already done it for all of us who are even this far along, right? That I know I've relied on people of color in my life in ways that they did because they care, or because they love me, or because for whatever reason they did, some because they were paid to do anti-racism trainings. But that is the fruit of a deeper relationship that I have with them, and not something that I would ever want to expect of them. Because it's harmful for people of color to continually be managing white people's emotions and feelings, while also being like, and please care about the fact that we're being killed by police, that we're dying in the desert, that we are not able to live life the way that So just like white folks who are aware of racism and white supremacy and white privilege need to talk to other white folks about white supremacy, in Harry Potter we find that purebloods aren't ever going to listen to Muggleborns about their pureblood supremacy, and so having other purebloods talk to each other about pureblood supremacy would potentially be a way to go about it. Granted, they're so entrenched in their ideals that it's hard to find purebloods who are anywhere in the middle, or like with the ability to move, right? Like the Malfoy family is very entrenched and there's no way they're gonna budge, but how do you find which of the pureblood families are not quite so entrenched that they're willing to move, willing to listen and to hear, and how do you approach them in that way that encourages them to change?
And even having those conversations with the people who will never change impact the people who overhear that conversation. And so it's all about figuring out which relationships allow for movement. Like Snape listens to Dumbledore, and other people listen to Snape who wouldn't listen to Dumbledore. And so Snape has some room to have those not that he's going to, because he has to maintain his status as a double agent. But he would could, otherwise. Or he could otherwise.
If he had lived, he probably would have been one of the main people to help sort that out. Deal
with that. Or Regulus Black could have, or Sirius Black could have, or that kind of thing. So, Sirius Black couldn't have after. Sirius Black could certainly talk to some people who wouldn't listen to anybody else, because goodness knows he didn't listen to anybody. So, I might also toss in there that if you're interested in learning more about how to have racial discussions, with people, and you're not familiar with the phrase white fragility, go ahead and do some Googling on that one. I found that term phenomenally helpful in terms of being able to put into words some of the problems that we have while we try to talk to each other about race and how it works.
I totally agree. I think Google can be harmful, but I think when Googling things like white fragility and white supremacy, Google actually is pretty on point. And if it's not,
Usually.
yeah. And
Yeah. If it's not, then that tells you something about your own search history, generally.
And if it's not, feel free to reach out to us at hpatchurch@gmail.com, and we can help equip you. But check out Google
Absolutely.
if you can. I also, speaking of reaping what you sow, we weren't, but we kind of were.
Well, we kind of were. In that way that so many of these conversations seem to loop back into themselves.
Yep.
It's almost like the lectionary people knew what they were doing.
What? In verse 7, when we hear Paul say, "For you reap whatever you sow," my immediate thought went to Crabbe and his fiend fire when he casts fiend fire in the room of requirement to try to get Harry and Hermione and Ron, and then ends up actually being killed by his own fiend fire. It's an extreme example of that, mind you, but
yes,
it's a fitting one too.
Yeah. I kind of love verse 11 because it just comes out of nowhere. And honestly, I don't know if this is how I'm supposed to understand verse 11, but I think it's a reference to how short the Galatians letter is compared to some of the other letters which had to be dictated, because he's clearly writing this one with his own hand. And so is this a lesson on how Ron and Harry should have had to dictate their essays to Hermione or someone else, or some kind of dictation quill? If they have quick quotes quills, I have to figure they must have a straight-up dictation quill. And then they all would have actually had to write essays of the similar length, instead of Ron and Harry writing essays that are technically half the length of Hermione's because their handwriting is so much bigger.
I've also heard that Paul would have been considered maybe legally blind, but had really poor eyesight.
Yeah, or some kind of chronic pain condition.
Mm-hmm. And so it was just difficult
that would have made
him.
Writing difficult. Yeah. Or maybe he just had really terrible handwriting. Or maybe he had ADHD, which makes you have really terrible handwriting, as I eventually discovered.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Fine motor control. I have great fine motor control when it comes to, say, decorating a dollhouse. My fine motor control for writing is pretty terrible.
Good to know.
And then in verse 13, verse 13 reminds me of, well, I guess I can't call it old yet, of a movie I really enjoy called Saved, which came out, I believe, in the early 2000s. And the characters in it are born-again Christians, and there's some parody involved, but there's also some really good, deep discussion of what it truly means to be Christian in the movie. And I just appreciate that it does have a sense of humor about itself. And there's a few bits where characters are boasting about how many people they have converted to Christianity, but it's not really about faith. It was about one-upping each other in context. So this verse reminds me of that, and it also reminds me, of course, of Draco bragging about his father. It's not really about how much his father loves him, it's about how awesome his dad is, and therefore how much power Draco has. So
nice. Yeah. I love the movie Saved.
Yeah, me too. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 11 and 16 through 20. Jesus sends out the 70 in pairs to share the news of his arrival and heal the sick. After facing some difficulty and much success together, they return to Jesus rejoicing, and he reminds them to not glory in the power they've been given, but in their everlasting life.
So one theme that is maybe pretty obvious is that of sending lots of people out. And I was thinking about that because Jesus sends out 70 people in pairs. And that, never happens in the magical world. Ever. The only times people are sent out are, sometimes in pairs, right? Hagrid and Madame Maxime both go out in pairs to go reach out to the giants. But it's mostly small, really secret missions and only a few people at a time. And then I was thinking, maybe the Death Eaters are doing it while they're recruiting. All of the Death Eaters are sent out 2 by 2 to, go recruit people on the sly.
Like at the World Cup?
Not at the World Cup, but like once Voldemort is back and he's recruiting on the sly while everybody's pretending he doesn't exist.
Yeah. Or I think the most people we saw sent out at once was getting Harry out of the Dursleys at the beginning of Deathly Hallows, wasn't it? That there were like 7 or 8 people for that. But they weren't sent out in pairs.
Actually, there were 14 people for that. And they were sent in pairs.
7 pairs.
Right? Because it was 7 pairs of people. So it was a Harry and somebody else. A Harry and somebody else. A Harry. And, 14 is like 1/5 of 70. But...
So that's kind of close. Mm-hmm. Not exactly, I mean, they weren't sending out to share good news or anything, but I think that's the biggest mission we saw.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is, like, there's just not the same...
Yeah. You don't really see that in... I think the closest... We always wind up comparing the gospel to Harry telling people Voldemort's back, which is not really a great comparison, but it's the closest you get.
Not actually good news.
Yeah, no, it's not. It is life-changing. It does lead to death and renewal, but not in a happy way. And I could totally see, like, Dumbledore's army sending out pairs of people to, no, seriously, let me explain this to you and make sure that you understand. But they didn't actually do that. So, as far as we know.
Yeah, I don't
That might have actually helped.
Right. Jesus talks about his sending his followers out as, I'm sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves, which, like, kind of, but not really. And I think partly the difference between Jesus and Harry is that what's happening in Harry's world is during a war, and Jesus is during occupation, but like a long-term occupation, and so there's a certain difference in, like, ability to move and
Jesus hasn't actually gotten to the point of having a reputation of being, like, treasonous and claiming to be king of anybody yet.
Yeah, he's just now just in the last a chapter ago set his face to Jerusalem. So it's
right.
Yeah.
So the people in power aren't angry at him yet.
So he has a little bit more freedom. So, like, yeah, you're kind of sending people out like lambs into the midst of wolves, but not really. Like, that's quite the hyperbole there, Jesus. But Aberforth does send Dubby. I'm, like, all about Dubby this episode. But Aberforth...
That happens a lot.
It does. Dubby's wonderful, and we're in the letters of Paul where Paul talks about slaves being slaves, so...
Yeah.
But Aberforth does ask Dubby to return to Malfoy Manor to rescue Harry and the crew, and that is sending Dubby like a lamb into the midst of wolves, and the result of that is obvious. It's about the most exact comparison as you could possibly get, I think.
Yeah, I have to wonder, like you said, I don't really think Jesus is sending him out quite like that, but is it more along the lines of, like, the first time that you let your young teen go out and about on their own, you kind of warn them to be a little extra paranoid than you would later?
Right, like the first time they're driving by themselves.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Maybe, put the
fear
of God in them.
Yeah, something like that. My parents were never big on the fear of God. They were always big on the fear of, their possible...
Oh, yeah. It was not about the fear of God for my parents either. It's the fear of punishment and disappointment.
Yeah. Yeah. Not abuse. I was not abused.
But there's just, like, everything about this is just so different than what happens in the magical world. Because even when the trio is traveling, and anyone who's traveling in Deathly Hallows, right? This goes for Ted Tonks, this goes for Dean, everybody. Jesus says, remain in the same house. Do not move about. Whenever you enter a town, eat what is set before you, cure the sick. Is like the exact opposite of what the trio's plan is. They move around constantly. They stay in different places. They try and be as quiet as they can. They don't expect
They're avoiding
any hospitality from people. Like, what they take, and then give payment. But they don't just eat. Nothing is set before them to eat. Right. They have to scrounge around for the mushrooms or whatever if they don't have a place that they can steal from.
But, I mean, their ultimate goals are quite different. They're not out to meet people.
Right, they're not trying to spread this news. That's the role of, like...
So it kind of makes sense that they do quite the opposite.
That's the role of, like, the radio station. Potter Watch.
Right. When we get to verse 16, I like this verse partly because you can almost hear Harry saying a version of this, that anyone who rejects that Voldemort is back rejects Dumbledore, and he rejects anyone who rejects Dumbledore. He just won't stand for that. This is just one of those verses where you can hear it in someone's voice, and I love it when that happens.
Well, and this actually, like, we can imagine Harry saying this, but Umbridge actually uses this when it comes to challenge, like, when McGonagall challenges her, or when anybody challenges her, it's, oh, but if you're challenging me, you're challenging the Minister of Magic, and I cannot have you challenging the Minister of Magic. And so every time.
Yes, but now you're comparing Umbridge with Jesus, and I take exception to that.
Okay, here's the deal. When we're doing these things, like, sometimes the examples, right? Like, we know this as Christians who are not fundamentalist.
Yeah.
People can use the same tactics for very different purposes.
Yes. And there's a bit in the Bible about even demons can quote scripture for their own purposes.
Mm-hmm. There's something about Jesus and the devil. I am in no way advocating for Umbridge's position, but it is, right, I think, poignant to notice the way that happens, and the way that she does it is not a healthy or life-giving thing, for sure.
Right.
But nor would, like,
and there
the
are
way
some
that Harry
things that Jesus gets to do. There are some things that Jesus gets to do because Jesus is Jesus, and people who aren't Jesus don't get to do those things because they aren't Jesus, and therefore they aren't God. And there, you know, like all of Jesus's claims to power and so forth. You know, if a normal person tells you stuff like that, back away slowly and do not, under any circumstances, join their cult or give them money. You know, and so when Umbridge does this, it's pretty creepy because normal people don't do that. Jesus isn't a normal person, but in a very, very different way than Umbridge.
Well, and even if Harry were to actually do that, it would still be problematic because, right, like...
He's putting Dumbledore on a pedestal if he says that if you reject Dumbledore, you reject me, and Dumbledore doesn't belong on one, as we've discussed before. And then in verse 20, ultimately, I think one of the many reasons why we just like Harry so much is that while he does enjoy magic for its own sake, and we see several scenes of how much fun it can be, not just flying on broomsticks, but also like making feathers float around with the tip of your wand. Sounds like fun. So he enjoys magic, but he doesn't revel specifically in the power that it gives him, but instead in the future that it gives him. In the same way, Jesus encourages the disciples to revel not in the power that they have, but in the future that they have. And I think that this is also another difference between him and Tom Riddle, because if Tom Riddle had focused on the future that magic could give him, instead of the power that magic gave him, he would have had a very different future.
And because of that, his future actually is, like, cut so much shorter than most normal magical people. Our final Sunday for this episode is the 5th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 10, also known as Lectionary 15, which falls on July 14th this year.
Bastille Day.
Really?
July 14th is Bastille Day. I have no idea if there's any relevance for the texts to this at all.
I don't really know what Bastille Day is. I think it's French.
Yes.
That's all I know.
Very good. It's part of the French Revolution story.
Huh.
There was a lot of people who died.
Oh, is that the, like, Les Mis part?
Not exactly, but not terribly different, I suppose. Okay.
The first reading for this Sunday is from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 9 through 14. Right. Moses tells the people of Israel that God will reward their obeying the commandments with prosperity, and that it will be possible and reasonable for them to do, because God's word is in their mouths and hearts. So a theme that came up for me is prosperity in community, right? Moses is not talking about individual prosperity, but the prosperity of the whole community. And I think the Weasleys, in so many ways, cultivate this prosperity together, even when they don't have the financial prosperity that might be helpful for this. There's always a sense of prosperity. There's always a sense of having enough, particularly around, like, food and meals, that they don't have to worry about it. Specifically in verse 9, though, the way that Moses talks about your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all your undertakings. There's a hint at prosperity gospel, which would take this out of context, but that's kind of the motto that the Gaunts seem to be operating under as purebloods. They expect that they will just always be prosperous because they are the best, because they are purebloods, and that's not actually like true or real.
Your comment on the Weasleys got me thinking about the absolute fortune you could make creating a magical equivalent of processed food and like easy to prepare meals.
Especially because you can always just use magic to make them bigger.
Getting back to what we were actually supposed to be talking about. Also in verse 9, the word you happens a lot in this verse, as tends to happen in the Bible. And all of the yous in the promises at the beginning of this passage are plural, not singular. It's to your community, not to you personally. Mm-hmm. Which makes me think about the difficulty of English not being good at distinguishing between singular and plural yous, as we continually see in the Bible and elsewhere, and the difficulties of translation. As you might imagine, translating Harry Potter, the books, was a mess and a half, with all the very on-point names and the Voldemort anagram and so on. And in fact, there's a whole Wikipedia page on it, which is quite the entertaining read, and we'll provide a link to that in our blog if you want to take a look at that. Also, if you're trying to make points to other people about the difficulty of translating the Bible, doing some comparisons to translating Harry Potter might be helpful, because boy, if you think Harry Potter was hard to translate, do I ever have some Bible translation stories for you. We'll include that link in our blog post, and I hope you enjoy it.
Although I have to say, it is not true that English is always difficult in differentiating between you singular and you plural, because for those of us who use y'all, it is real easy to get a clear sense of you and y'all. And I think
that then there's the difference between y'all and all y'all, and you have to get very specific about which version of Southern you're being.
I'm being the version of Southern that comes through my genetics. And
that's fair.
But I think I think if we were to have, I think the next English Bible translation should have y'all, or at very least some indicator of when it is plural, because I think that would have a fundamental and profound impact on how people understand what is written in the Bible.
I would imagine the Cotton Patch Gospels would have that.
I don't know for sure. I haven't read them.
Yeah.
I've heard of them and stuff, but I don't think I've ever actually.
Yes, I've heard excellent things.
Well, and in verses 11 through 14, we hear, "Surely this commandment, or word, that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart." This reminded me of the prophecy about Voldemort and Harry, that it feels like it's, and in theory, it's really far off, right? It's all the way in the Ministry of Magic. Right. Only two people in the entire wizarding world, only two people in the entire magical world can even get it. So it's really far away. But then the reality after they've gone through such great lengths to get it, and it slips out of Neville's pocket and crashes and nobody hears it, the reality is it is right there with them. Not only because it is quite literally in Dumbledore's memories, but everybody starts to get a sense of the heart of it, right? That the rumors spread that Harry's the chosen one, even though nobody knows exactly what the prophecy says. The only people who have any sense of it are Dumbledore, Harry, Ron and Hermione, because Harry tells them, and Snape, but Snape even only knows the beginning part.
Right.
Yeah.
Also with these verses, keep in mind, as Moses talks about how, you don't have to make any enormous journeys to be able to get there, to figure this out. Keep in mind that Moses is speaking to people who have now been wandering in the desert for 40 years. So, when you're trying to translate this into Harry Potter world, I'd like to imagine Harry talking to his fellow fifth years at the end of the year, saying that believing that Voldemort is back shouldn't be too hard for them because it's not like they have to take yet another owl exam to believe it.
Ooh, yeah. That's a good way of thinking about it. I like that.
Second reading for this Sunday is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. The author greets the Colossians with thankfulness and prayers, praising God for the many gifts they have been given.
So one theme that is evident for me in this reading from Colossians is the way that the good news, the gospel, inspires good fruit. That the news of something good then inspires the works. Not because it requires them, but because that's a natural response to them. And so then I was thinking about like the news of the break-in at Gringotts, right? That's one of the first things that people are talking to Harry about when he gets to Hogwarts. But the news of the break-in at Gringotts spreads to Hogwarts and throughout Hogwarts, and it inspires a gathering of people. It inspires people to come back together, and then inspires the rebellion. And I imagine that when they heard news of any of the other points, right? If they heard the news of Harry breaking into the ministry, that each of those points would be sparks of inspiration for people to then bear good fruit, to then resist. And so part of what the author is doing in Colossians is giving thanks for the people of Colossus.
Yes.
And so then I was thinking about in verse 3, when the author says, "In our prayers for you, we always thank God." I was thinking about who Hermione would give thanks for. We always can, like, it's really easy for us to think of all the people that Harry would give thanks for, to Ron and Hermione, and right, like that whole list, because he kind of reiterates it throughout, and he's our perspective.
Yeah.
But who would Hermione give thanks for? Librarians. I think she would give a lot of thanks for McGonagall. I think she has a deep, deep respect for McGonagall and the ways that she both follows the rules and finds ways to subvert them, particularly in like year 5, to support the students and to protect the students. But I don't know who else. Like, there's not...
I really would have loved to have seen a bit between her and Trelawney after the Battle of Hogwarts.
Mm-hmm.
Because once she knows where the prophecy comes from and that Trelawney's gift is real, even if it's not
as prolific.
Yeah, as obvious as Trelawney thinks it is. That would have been really interesting. Also, I think, Emma Thompson and oh goodness, I'd never noticed Emma Thompson and Emma Watson. They would have had a great scene. Man, why don't they act opposite each other all the time?
That would have been brilliant.
So, in verses 4 and 5, we hear of the Colossians having the love they have for all the saints because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. That is, they have love for all Christians no matter what, because we all share the same God. We all share the same hope. And we've talked before in this podcast about how not all of the order like each other very much. But I don't think that we've said that that's actually normal and pretty healthy, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. Any large group is going to have a wide variety of personalities, and not all personalities mesh well, and that's okay. Now, real hatred and contempt, like what's between Snape and Sirius, that's a whole different thing. But not everybody is going to get along with everybody else, and that's reasonable.
One of my friends, Pastor Laura Gruen, talked about part of being in multicultural space is that you will probably be uncomfortable 50% of the time. And if you're not uncomfortable, your space is not multicultural, right? There's an aspect of engaging with people of different cultures that increases discomfort. And when there are multiple people,
you feel less at home.
And when there are people of multiple cultures, and yet, particularly for those of us who are white, if we feel comfortable the whole time, it's most likely because other people are not able to bring their whole selves and their true selves into the space.
Yes. I'm also a big fan of a online advice column called Captain Awkward, and she, who writes the column, is in turn a big fan of something called the Geek Social Fallacies, which we are also including a link to in our blog post. And a fallacy is, and here I am putting on my philosophy major hat again, a fallacy is an argument made in a logical way that is fundamentally logically flawed. So fallacy number 4 is the idea that friendship is transitive, that just because your friends are friends with you, they should also be friends with each other.
Mm-hmm.
As anyone with a varied friend group will tell you, this is not actually true. It is fallacious. It is wrong. Not all your friends are going to be friends with each other. You don't have to try to make them. It's not going to work anyway. And so the thing is Christians can love one another. Christians can be Christian towards one another. Christians can wish the peace of God for one another, without actually being friends, and with not acknowledging that we are different enough that we might not want to hang out together all the time, and that's okay. And that's also a line that a lot of congregations have serious issues with, finding that line. So,
especially with pastors, I think there's a way that for a lot of, not always, but a lot of people want to be friends with their pastor, and that's...
Yeah. And if they aren't, they think that there's either something wrong with them or something wrong with their pastor, or I regularly say, it's not actually my job to be liked. Like, if I am liked, that's nice sometimes. Sometimes it gets in the way. But that's not actually part of my job. But explaining that to people takes a while.
For sure.
So, I like to point out that there's a difference between like and love. And, oh, look, I'm about to start quoting 10 things I hate about you. We can love each other without liking each other, or without trying to be like each other. And that's okay. And I don't think we say that often enough.
And not only is it okay, it's actually like good and wonderful, because we should be able to be our whole selves, and that means we're not going to be like anybody else. Speaking of being our whole selves, I was struck in verses 9 through 13 that the author pulls out different themes and different emphases for their prayers. And they actually, like, it took me, I think, till verse 10, I was like, oh, wait, these could be the houses. And then I looked and was like, yes, they could. So if you think about the different prayers, verse 9, where the author is praying, they would be filled with knowledge and spiritual wisdom and understanding, is a pretty easy go-to for Ravenclaw. And then verse 10, that you would lead lives worthy of God, fully pleasing, bear fruit in every good work, is a pretty solid Hufflepuff, like, do good work hard. And then verse 11, may you be made strong with all the strength that comes from God's glorious power, endure everything, is a very Gryffindor-ish prayer. And then in verses 12 and 13, the author talks about that God has enabled you to share in the inheritance of the saints. God has rescued us and transformed us into the reign of the beloved Son of God, in whom we have redemption. Feels pretty Slytherin to me. It's a little bit more of a stretch than the other ones, but there's a way in which, like, inheritance and kind of that familial line feels very Slytherin to me compared to the other houses.
And perhaps even the direct relationship to the powerful God. Like, part of being Slytherin is being ambitious and cunning, and therefore I feel like having a direct relationship with God, rather than dealing with intermediaries, would be... Yeah,
and the, like, God has my back, so I have God's back, kind of, like, tit for tat type of thing.
I can see it. It would be difficult to explain at any length, but yeah, that's interesting. And I really like the other three. I'm totally on board with that. Yeah, and speaking of the other three, for verses 11 and 12, so the author basically prays that they may be strong, patient, and joyful, right? So I'm asking myself, who from the Harry Potter books does that describe? There are a lot of people who meet like 2 out of 3 of those, but all 3 of them is a little harder to come up with. So far, I have Hagrid and I have Professor Sprout. Considering a lot of the plants that Professor Sprout has to deal with, I am not questioning her strength. Also, there's the whole, being a head of house at Hogwarts, and you have to be strong to be able to pull that off. Other than that, strong, patient, and joyful, that is not a very common combination in the magical world, as far as I can tell. And certainly not in the Muggle world, as far as we see it through Harry's eyes.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I like Hagrid and Professor Sprout, though. I think they're good ones.
Yeah. So if you think of any, please let us know. We'd be very interested.
Who do you think is strong, patient, and joyful? I feel like that's a song. No, I'm thinking of Young, Gifted, and Black.
It should be. Well, that is a song, yes.
I don't know. In my head, it like fits
Speaking
together.
Of, speaking of three characteristics that don't often come together in the midst of the Harry Potter series.
Oh, J.K. Rowling. Oh, yeah.
Oh, Blaze Sabidi. Moving on.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. When questioned by a lawyer on earning eternal life and justification, Jesus tells the parable of a man cared for by a Samaritan who was part of a marginalized community and not well thought of by the crowd gathered with Jesus. So, one of the main themes in this passage and parable is what to do with people who are injured. So, leaving them or helping them. And the trio encounter people who are at risk or injured a couple different times and have different options for what to do. So, like, they just leave the Death Eaters in the coffee shop in Deathly Hallows and, in fact, actually, like, wipe their minds.
Yeah.
But in other places, they don't leave them. So they don't leave Grip Hook and Dean and the others at Malfoy Manor. They take them with them and help them. Or they don't leave Lockhart in the Chamber of Secrets. They take him with them once he's lost his memory and those sorts of things. So I think in general their practice is to take people with them, but it doesn't always happen. And in the battle, you can't take everybody with you. You have to, if people fall or get hurt, like, you can help them to a certain extent, but ultimately there's a limit to what you can do. I also, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about in verse 25, if Malfoy were the lawyer, like, I could totally see Malfoy wanting to test Jesus, right? And so if Malfoy's the lawyer, then to tell the parable well, I think the Samaritan would have to be a muggle, not just a muggle-born, but a muggle that Malfoy despises and looks down so much on muggles that would be the connection point with Samaritans, because Jewish people and
I might even say a poor
muggle. Yeah. Because Jewish people and Samaritans did not get along at all. And so the idea for Jesus talking to Jewish people of a Samaritan being the one to come and help the person who is assumed to be Jewish, who has fallen into the hands of robbers, would be so scandalous. Similarly, like, if Jesus were Samaritan and talking to Samaritans, it would have been, and flipped it, that would have been equally as scandalous, right? This was a mutual, they were marginalized from each other within communities, but also, like, did not get along across communities.
Right. Yeah, growing up, when we tried to translate this parable into modern day society and who would be a Samaritan to us, it was always a drug dealer.
Well, and I think a lot of, like, for the church, I think a lot of it for, like, predominantly straight people, having the Samaritan be part of the queer community would make sense. I think particularly, right, like a Black trans woman.
Yeah.
Because of the way the church so frequently is so horrible.
Yeah.
Which makes me sad as a queer person, like, as a queer non-binary person to say that, but...
Yeah. Well, I think that's related to, you've told me before that you don't like the common name for this parable.
Yeah, right, like, to call the parable the story of the Good Samaritan would be as if we were calling it, like, the good gay, the good queer person, and that's just...
We're not implying that only this Samaritan is good.
Yep. And continuing that, as the lawyer is testing and asking justifying questions, it reminded me actually of Hermione's strategic questions and comments to Umbridge at the beginning of their 5th year, where she's really trying to poke and prod and get at Umbridge's denial of Voldemort and Voldemort's return, and the ways that she's being really harmful as she's teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts, and Hermione's, like, read the entire book and has all the questions and all of that stuff. And so I think Hermione actually does, like, a really good job of doing that strategic thinking and questioning and testing and justifying.
Yeah. And that's related to my next point, because The thing is, I have heard so many people dump on the lawyer for asking questions. There are so many people who love to dump on any question asker in the Bible and assume that they're just trying to make trouble. I love people who ask questions. I love asking questions. I love Hermione's questions and that she asks questions. And so, related to that, a question I rarely hear asked is the lawyer our neighbor? Is the lawyer Jesus's neighbor? And so, like, if you're going to compare that to the Harry Potter world, speaking of someone who asks questions and tends to irritate people, what would it have meant for Snape, for example, to see Hermione as his neighbor in that way in the first book, even if he did personally find her annoying? This goes back to the whole concept that you can love someone and not like them. And if he'd been able to treat her as truly one of his students, I mean, the way he treats Slytherins. Plenty of the Slytherins are irritating, for crying out loud. And he treats them very well. And so I wonder how that would have been different if people could see each other as neighbors that way.
I don't really hear the lawyer getting dumped on a ton, but I do know that, like, the lawyer is not portrayed in a great light, and part of it is, I think, because the framing is that the lawyer wants to test Jesus.
Yes.
But, yeah, I do think that that's a good...
But, I mean, let's be fair. Jesus says some pretty off-the-wall things, at least compared to what the society back then said. So wanting to test him isn't necessarily wanting him to get arrested.
Yeah, no.
It might just be, let's see if what he says kind of holds up consistently under different conditions. You know, I want to see if this guy's internally
It's like right now in the, like, election cycle, right? Testing the candidates, being like, well, so you said this, but what about this? Or, yeah,
exactly. And in that case, questioning is very important. And then in verses 31 and 32, so I am totally on board with, in the Harry Potter version of this story, the Samaritan would be a muggle. So my next question is, who would the priest and the Levite be? Like, if we're specifically casting Draco as the lawyer, I think that at least one of those two would have to be his father. There's no way around that. But if the lawyer is just some random member of the magical community at large, maybe one of them could be an Auror, and the other one could be a Hogwarts teacher, with the implication that the man who was robbed was a former student.
Maybe, or like Snape, right? That Snape might even be a good one for Draco specifically, but I wouldn't necessarily. I guess it's tricky because I wouldn't necessarily expect. It depends if it ends up that Malfoy is like thinking of him. If Malfoy ends up having to think of himself as the person in the ditch, then it would make sense that both Lucius and Snape would come save him. But we're also supposed to be thinking about, like, a category of people, right?
Right, which is why I say if the lawyer is some random member of the magical community, and therefore the guy in the ditch is some random member of the magical community, then who would the Aurora and who would the priest and the Levite be in this story?
I think I could see one being a teacher, a Hogwarts teacher.
I like the idea of the Aurora. I can never say that correctly. Sure, whatever. Of the magical law enforcement agent. I like the idea of that because the person has been robbed. So, therefore, presumably, they would be, interested in this as a crime of some sort that they should probably address professionally. But no, apparently not.
It's tricky, though, because, right, like, part of why the priest and Levite are there is that they are, like, role models around morality and what is moral and ethical. And that's not the role of law enforcement. Well, that's not a role that law enforcement
and goodness
fulfills.
knows, in the 90s in Britain, they knew that too. There were some interesting stories coming out of Britain in the 90s when this was being written. When Harry Potter was being written, not the Bible. The Bible was not written in the 90s in Britain.
Yeah. I mean, I almost feel like it would be like the Minister of Magic.
Ooh, I like that.
Right? Like, it's supposed to be a really important person who has a leadership guiding role.
The head of the Wizengamot?
Yeah, that would also work. All good things to ponder.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the 6th to the 8th Sundays after Pentecost.
This podcast has been produced by us Emily Ewing, and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles, so make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do, or want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes, or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/HPATCHURCH, HP at Church. Not only do you get access to special insights or mentions in our episodes, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everyone has a quick quotes quill.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax vobiscum.